Hi, and welcome to week 5 of Social Work 664, Treating Trauma. And in week 5, we are really starting to think about different modes of therapy. And so, we want to begin with the body because it really is the seat of that sensory experience of trauma. And, what we know is that trauma is not a cognitive experience. It is not this movie that is continuously playing in someone's head, although that might be part of it. But it is the activated alarm system that continues to go and go and go, believing that the past is the present, that the trauma is still present, and continuing to scan the environment at a really unconscious level for the threat to occur again. So we're going to look at the body as a resource, as Rothschild says. And van der Kolk presents lots of different treatment modalities in some of the research that he's done and other people have done from a somatic standpoint. So I want you to think about the clients that you do serve and try to think about which interventions might actually be appropriate in your practice, whether your practice normally includes some of this somatic work or whether it's something you can really add in a subtle way. And as we're thinking about working with clients around trauma information, one thing I think can be helpful is if you imagine a can of paint. And so it would be, a white can of paint, and your job is to slowly drip, could be, a dark blue paint in there. And so with the first drip or the second drip or the third drip, you may not even see any color begin to develop. It's still white, it's still pale white. And yet over time, after you continue to drip, little drops of this blue paint in, the color will eventually begin to change. And I think about this with trauma information is that we want to be careful with information that we do share, recognizing the capacity of trauma information to actually trigger people, or to also make people feel like they're overwhelmed by some of that information, or just that they're impacted and they are not able to heal in that way. So that being said, we have different readings for this week. We'll have our discussion board, our typical multiple dimensions of social work discussion. We have our technique discussions and the demonstrations. And then last of all, we have our week 5 journal. So our focus for this week and our goals are really for you to have a chance to begin observing some of those bodily responses of people who are impacted by trauma. We also want you to come away from this week being able to talk about different treatment approaches that we know are either evidence-based or have emerging research around it that does say it can support people who are impacted by trauma. And last of all, we want you to be able to demonstrate some techniques used to increase that affect regulation, emotional regulation, trust, relaxation, and stress reduction. And with the technique demonstrations that have been done, there have been some beautiful ways to utilize breathing, to really de-escalate, to calm this activated nervous system and our trigger response. And so I think that these have really been done in a way that are supportive for us as we practice, but also for us to be able to instruct others. We also have been exposed to some bodily practices so far in the technique demonstrations, and this is also really essential because we do know that working with the body first, even though we may be a clinician who does talk therapy, can be a valuable resource toward stopping things like anxiety or panic attacks, stopping flashbacks in the middle of them being triggered, and helping a traumatized individual begin to know what their body is doing that ends up triggering the survival response. And so our readings for this week, we have an article about a therapeutic approach to the treatment of a racist incident-based trauma. We have another chapter in The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. This one you'll find interesting, and as with all the chapters, it can be quite difficult. So make sure you're using your personal safety plan at that point. And we have a chapter in Rothschild and Van der Kolk as well. And so you'll see all of the readings really dovetail with each other this week. In week 5, we have our multiple dimensions of social work forum. And for this, we are going to focus on the chapter 8 in Bruce Perry's book. And you will have your different dimension. Notice that we switch each week as we've been doing, so hopefully by now you're getting in a flow. Students are doing really well at including citations and connecting us with the information. So this is the ultimate goal. You just really want to integrate all of the information we're learning about, reading about, applying some of that, and do that in a concise but also detailed way. The response to appear is optional, and I'm going to challenge you in week 5 to attempt to do that secondary response, to really, as you read through some of your peers' responses, choose one that resonates with you and try to really respond and enhance their information. It is optional, however. Our second discussion forum for this week are our technique demonstrations. So for those that are assigned this week for the technique demonstration, you'll submit that video and the written instructions as an initial post. Just a reminder, you're also going to do that in a major projects and assignments area. And then for everyone else, the peer response post that is due by Sunday is really watching the technique demonstration video and sharing something that you really like about the video, and also how it worked for you or could kind of change to work for you better. Definitely include a sentence or two to share about a population that you can use the technique with your practice. And your stretch goal for this week is really to incorporate some of our content of the course, or link someone to further information, something to really enhance their personal knowledge about the technique demonstration that they did present. After that, our final activity for this week is our weekly journal or biweekly journal. So this is due on Sunday, and you want to really begin to reflect on your personal reactions to the material through the lenses of those 3 questions that I've presented. So one is, how has your personal understanding changed? How has your view of others changed? And how has your practice changed? So for this week, I wanted to highlight a concept about brain states. And this information is really from Bruce Perry's work in the Child Trauma Academy. And it is one of the foundations in his neurosequential model of therapeutics, which is a bottom-up brain approach to healing trauma. So a very developmental kind of approach where brain mapping is actually done. And there's a school in Philadelphia or outside of Philadelphia, Lakeside Educational Network, and there are a number of behavioral or schools for youth that are behaviorally challenged. And in these schools, brain mapping is actually done. And what it is attempting to do is recognizing at the time of trauma, what age was this person, what stage of brain development, and how did this impact the brain state that they're often in. And so what you're looking at right now is really a grid of at the top row, there are different areas of the brain that are responsible for different things. So we know um, when we're in our neocortex, we are really in our top thinking, planning, abstracting part of our brain. And this typically develops last. It's typically the most complex, and the area that ends up being wired last. And it's very, as all areas, very use dependent. And when we're in our neocortex, we're really able to think about the future. We're really able to abstract and plan. And this is last to develop, as I mentioned, begins somewhere in adolescence, and even prior, and continues all the way until around 28 for women and 30 for men, give or take. And so this might explain why, when you're in your young adult years, that we're not always operating from the most rational, logical thinking part of our brains as we make future decisions. When we're in that zone in our brains, we're able to think in an abstract way, and we are feeling calm. So you can imagine this calm is the experience of sort of sitting in a room with a cup of tea, or, looking out on a beach scenery. This is really the ideal brain state in some ways to do complex thinking. And we're not often in that brain state. Things like breathing can help, things like affect regulation, things like getting us in our calmest mode, sort of neurobiologically. And this is what our technique demonstrations are really good at beginning to impact. Next, you'll see in this row the limbic part of the brain. And the limbic, we know, is responsible for, it's really the seat of emotions, and so emotional control. And that this begins to develop when, we're toddlers and we're throwing our tantrums and having our meltdowns and really trying to understand what feelings are. And it continues to grow. When there is a trauma that happens during this stage of development, we know that someone's ability to regulate their emotions and their affect is severely compromised. When we're in a very emotional part of our brain, we can think in very concrete terms, and we don't have the full capacity of our very complex brain to think with at that moment. We're thinking very concrete solutions. And this is really when our brain is in kind of an alert mode. So we can think about if we're in a room, a classroom, and we hear sort of a knock at the door. Prior to that, we might have felt like we were calm. And then when we hear a knock at the door, our eyes head to the door. We tend to be a little bit more alert. We're wondering what's happening next. What surprise will be at the door? Who's going to be at the door? Is someone going to be late? And we begin to think about what's happening. Our time in that moment is really just thinking in the context of days and hours. So when we're in different parts of our brain and we're actually thinking from that part of our brain, we think in different ways. We think in concrete ways, and we think in the passage of days and hours on a time scale. However, if something occurred to move our brain states to alarm, say that the knocking got really loud and was banging and someone was trying to come in the door of our classroom, we may move to alarm, or even fear, or even terror. So even lower brain states. And this results in our brain literally dropping to a different functioning part. And we may move toward a sense of hours, minutes, seconds, or just have a total loss of time. And this is all correlated with where our brain state is in that moment and what our brain state is being asked to respond to. So we can think of, in a car accident, there may be a complete loss of a sense of time in the moment of the accident. And why this is important, this concept of brain states, is because by recognizing brain states of someone we're working with, if they're in an alarm state, a terrorized state, or an alert state, we can talk brain to brain in that way to find ways to move them up to a higher place in the brain. Hopefully this demonstration of brain states was helpful, And you can find more information on childtrauma.com.